Hello, hello. Can you hear me? Hello. How about that? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thanks. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Let's get going. All right. Um, all right. Welcome back. Okay. Let's see. So we did not meet on Monday. There was a holiday. And so instead, what we're going to do is that we're going to meet today, and then I was proposing to meet tomorrow again. Um, so so yeah. So uh, uh, same time, just like today. uh, and we'll just continue the material. I was hoping that we would not fall behind. So want to move ahead. Also, the quiz. I did find a problem with the quiz, so I need to move it later in the week. I've been making a couple of changes. I need to make sure that all sections have the same quiz and testing it. So I'll make that available later tomorrow. Quizzes. I missed quiz two. I wonder. Yeah, come to office hours. If you did miss a quiz, uh, feel free to come to office hours, and I can unlock it for you. Again, I'm meeting every day at 8 in the morning, except on Thursdays. On Thursdays, we meet at 11 in the morning. So tomorrow at 11 in the morning. So if you missed it, please come and I'll unlock it for you. For quiz three, I'm still tweaking, making sure that all sections have the same exact quiz. Uh, there, there were a couple questions that were too advanced that had about material that we have not covered yet. So yeah, that should be available later, either tonight or tomorrow morning. So I'll make that available. Again, you'll have 48 hours to take the quiz. It'll be opened up, and then 48 hours later, it will close. So you should get at least 2 evenings for you to be able to take the quiz. All right, so let's take a look at the syllabus. Oops. Chat. All right, let's look at the syllabus. Let's just see where we are at and where we're going. Right, so we are getting started with week 5. Right? We recently completed week 4, where we discussed JavaScript as the programming language of the web that allows us to control the browser by interacting with the DOM. So we can manipulate the data structure that renders what you see on the screen in the browser. And that way we can create user interfaces that interact with the user, that can listen for keystrokes, mouse movements, keyboard, mouse, and all the various ways to interact. And that they respond by being able to manipulate the DOM, right? By highlighting things, changing colors, fonts, moving things around, hiding, showing. So yeah, that's what we covered last week. We also saw that we could break up. We could use now JavaScript as a means for dynamic, not only dynamic content, but also as a strategy for modularizing, right, or making components out of HTML. Right? Instead of having hard-coded HTML documents, we saw that we can replace a lot of that with JavaScript files that can can render not only HTML but dynamic HTML, right? Like you can mix and match loops and logic, if statements, branching, all within JavaScript, embedded inside of HTML. Well, sorry, HTML embedded inside of JavaScript. And so what we use that to break out the the Explore screen, right, and several other screens into JavaScript files, right, that can then import each other, right, and build up complex screens. And this really introduces a great opportunity, right, to use a lot of the techniques that are familiar to us in other fields in computer science, right? That component-based technology, all sorts of software engineering techniques of applying top-down design, bottom-up design, modularization, and then being able to aggregate all this content into ever more complex applications, right? So yeah, that's what we introduced last week. So today we're going to introduce React.js. And so React.js looks at this, right, this opportunity to create component out of JavaScript and HTML and combines with CSS and whatnot. Right, and it creates a library that takes advantage of this strategy. It says, ooh, we could break out all these, we could think about web pages, not as just static HTML documents, but now we can start thinking about, ooh, I could break out maybe the header over here of this word editor, right? And maybe that could be a component, right? And maybe this menu could be components. Maybe these dropdowns could be components, right? And we can start thinking about, ooh, I could have each one of these be a separate JavaScript file, right? That can be tested and developed independently, right? And then combined and aggregated with other components that talk to one another and share a common data model. So all these are concerns of software engineering in general, right? And you've certainly been applying those concerns and those techniques, those strategies elsewhere. Well, they are also applicable here, right? Now that we have a mechanism of abstracting or creating a layer of abstraction on top of the browser in terms of components, that this really opens up a great opportunity for improving the quality and the complexity of types of applications that we can tackle. So today we're going to introduce React.js as a library that allows us to do that. Okay. Next week we'll continue with React.js. Actually, for the remainder of the semester, right, we're going to be doing React.js for the whole foreseeable future. Well, at least for the next 10 to 12 weeks. Next week we'll talk about Redux, which is it's a React library that allows us to maintain application state. We'll also take a look at React Context API. That's another mechanism for maintaining state. And then after that, the week after that, we'll have a review, the first lecture, and then the second lecture will be the exam. So that exam will be like the quizzes, right? It will be available for a couple of days, right? And you can choose when to take the exam. You'll need about an hour and a half to the whole exam, but you can choose when that is. Yeah, so that's the plan for the next couple of weeks. All right, excellent. Any questions? All right, so let's get going. Let's see. Where did we leave off last week? Let's see, we are here. Let's see, Git branch. Right, so we were working on A5, and we commit everything. And we worked on the explore screen on how to break it out into multiple components, right? And use JavaScript uh, to bring it back all together, right? So we looked at the, the Twitter explore screen, which is this one, which basically was a JavaScript file, right? That grabbed the explore div, took the HTML, this HTML, took so the HTML is basically empty, right? The only thing that it does is that it loads Bootstrap. It creates a entry point for us to inject dynamic content in there, and then index basically was grab that index, that explore ID div, right, and append it, right, a whole bunch of divs, the navigation, the main content, the follow. So created a couple of rows and columns in there. So we can take a look at what that looked like. So this is what it looked like. And now we can see that there was a component that rendered this left-hand side, another component that rendered the follow, then a component that rendered the main content here in the center. Right. So that's what we introduced last week. Right. So each component was implemented as a separate function, right? That just returns a string, and that string could be hard-coded like this, or if it's a main content, it could include some another string, right? It was a whole bunch of strings that eventually all got concatenated into one big string, right? And then injected into the main content. Again, a lot of these reusable components can be broken out into separate files that can then be imported, right? And then we can call the function, and it just replaces it with a string that gets concatenated with everything else. Right? So that could be all hard-coded, like this tab, or it could be something more dynamic, right? Where we iterate over perhaps an array of tweets. So it's an array of tweets that, as we iterate, we render a bunch of tweet components that can take as argument a object that represents a tweet, and then takes the values, right, in that object, and it renders each one of them as a line item in a UL, right? As always, we forgot to see these commas here. That means that we forgot to do a join, because again, we're working with strings. Refresh, that's gone. Okay. Let's see. This question says, how do I get an element by its ID in the function where I am returning HTML? By ID. You get it like it indicates, right? You use a $. $sign is available to you. You can say here, you can grab some content and you can say $, some hash, and right now the explore div. So there's the explore div right there. Right? Explore div, and then I can do whatever I want with it. Right? Yeah. So $sign is the alias for jQuery, and that's available throughout the application.
Sorry, Professor. So my question was like, when I'm returning this HTML, I have to, let's say, insert some classes, CSS classes, to one of the divs using ID. So I want to grab whatever I'm returning, the ID, whatever I'm returning, but not the one that is. For example, the div class row has, let's say it has an ID. I want to grab them and add it dynamically.
Yeah. So you could you could just assign this to something, a const result, or and say $sign. Now result is a jQuery object that can be manipulated, right? So you can say, say you have this row here has an ID, or say, I don't know, this H1 also has an ID, right, of TWE. Then say, well, you would return at some point, right? Return the results. But before you return it, you can manipulate the result dot find hash TWE, right? And then you paint it the color. Oh, that's an H1, right? So H1 that would be color. Then say paint it red. So I don't know what that does. Oh, okay, so that's the URL. That's result now is a result is now a jQuery object that we are manipulating, and I think you can return the object div element to string maybe. Let's see. Convert it to string again. I don't know. I need to. But you can certainly manipulate it. You need to convert it back into string because that's what it's expecting, right? Let's see what this returns. But my point is that you would not do this, right? You would not. You would stay away from directly manipulating the DOM. So you would wanna do something that that manipulates this. So this div, right? You would create the logic here that would decide what to do with that H1, right? So the logic would be in here as opposed to grabbing it later, manipulating it, and then putting it back. Does that make sense? Actually, this could be just a string. Right, then you just return the string. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, we can take a look at it. What is that you want to try and do? Right. That's the whole point of using React.js and using this paradigm is that you're not actually going and manipulating the DOM. You are calculating it, right, and then putting it into the DOM. Okay. So why don't we take a look at it if you come to office hours, we can take a look at it together on what is it that you're trying to do for that specific ID. Okay, so let's take a look at it. So what we're going to do today is we're going to refactor all this, right, and convert them into React components. Right. This is kind of going towards that of creating these components. It introduces the idea of breaking it up into multiple modules that you can then import and use. But it's not using React.js. So let's introduce React.js. Okay, so React.js, when we created this project, this was a React.js project. We go to the index here, and you run this index. You have now this hyperlinks that allow you to go to different. But your voice sounds a little patchy. You don't hear me? But does it sound funny? It's not as loud as usual. Ooh, let's see. What's going on here? Let's open it. Audio. Hello. Is this high? We'll try another one. Let's see. Hello, 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 hello. Can you hear me? Hi, can you hear me? Still distorted? Hello? Can you hear me? Is that any better? Try turning off the automatic adjust. Automatically adjust. Hello? Hello? Is that better? Using the computer mic. Oh, is that it? Hello? 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 Steve? Hello? Hello? Is that any better? Hello? Can you hear me? It's a little better? What's going on? How about now? Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay. All right. I guess there's a little knob here that increases the volume of my speakers, my microphone. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is the HTML that we have been working as the entry point to the application. But if you do remember, right, this HTML used to be like this. Used to not have any of this. And actually, let me commit this into branch 5. I don't want to break that. So I'm gonna put terminal commit, put this in Java script. This intro JavaScript. I'm gonna commit this, and I'm going to push. Well, I'm going to push it later. So I'm going to create a new branch with checkout speed a. Okay. All right. So for A6, for today's lecture, what we're going to do is that we're going to remove all that, all those labs that we've been working so far. We're going to remove that. And instead, we're going to uncomment or put back this div to the root. Okay. And we're going to now use the same technique that we've been using for the last couple of lectures, using JavaScript to inject content dynamically into this div. Okay. But we're not going to be using raw JavaScript. Well, we are in a little bit of it, a very, very tiny bit of it, just to get us started. Right? But from there on, React.js is going to take control. Right? It's going to keep going from there. So this div with this ID root, just like we use jQuery, right, to inject content dynamically, here we're going to use React.js to do the same thing. And the entry point for this, right, just like right, a tweet with the entry point where this HTML, right, with this div, right, and then there was a JavaScript that grabbed it, injected the content. Same thing here. In the index.html here, we have an ID of root. And then in the source directory now, we're going to have this index.js. So this index.js is going to be the entry point for the React.js application. And here's where React.js grabs that root by its ID. Right? It creates a root object, and then it renders, meaning it injects into that root, into this root ID. It injects this content. It renders this stuff. Okay. And what is that stuff? Is, well, there's some React strict mode, which I'm not going to talk about right now. But in particular, what we have is this app thing that looks like a tag. It's not really a tag. It looks like a tag. It behaves like a tag, but it's not really a tag. It's really this app here. And this app is the equivalent of us doing this. You know, what we used before, we said app, and it was a function of that. Okay. But React.js dresses it up a little bit, dresses it up and says, okay, well, we're going to abstract the fact that this app is actually a function that you are invoking and that we are concatenating whatever that returns, we're concatenating with the rest of the content, just like we did for our Explorer, right, where we call the function, right, and we are concatenating it with the rest of the content around it. This is the same thing. This app is just basically a function that gets called and gets concatenated with the rest of the content. But React.js dresses it up a little bit, right, to make it look as if it were a natural HTML tag. Right? It's as if, you know, React.js would allow us to do instead something like, instead of navigation, it would be nice if this looked like HTML, like navigation, right? And then we could close it off. That'd be awesome. Okay. Then, if that would be true, you wouldn't have this kind of weird intermediate, right? You can, you know, this was HTML, and nice, HTML, and then you find this function call. What the heck is that? And then you go back to HTML, and then the function call, you know, all HTML, blah 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 blah, right? So it'd be nice if it looked as if you would always be in HTML. Okay, and that's the main abstraction idea that React.js introduces. That this app is really this import over here, which if you go in there, it's just basically a function. Look at that. It's a function that has that name, and it returns a whole bunch of HTML. Another abstraction that React.js introduces is that, notice that in our case, in our Explorer, we are always working with strings. Right? This whole HTML here, this one big HTML content here, is just one huge string. Right? It's just one big string. What React.js does is that it introduces the abstraction that these are not strings. Okay, that this actually reads as if this were JavaScript, and then you somehow seamlessly transition into HTML. See that? Okay, and then when you're done with HTML, HTML, and when you're done, you seamlessly transition back to JavaScript. See that? Okay, whereas there is no abstraction in our implementation. This is clearly a string, which is still a data type, a very common data type in JavaScript. So we never left JavaScript. Okay, we're always are in JavaScript. We were just using the cool feature that backticks allows us to break up long strings into separate lines. Okay. And so we could, make the mental gymnastics of thinking about this as if this was a HTML, but it isn't, right? It's just a string. Whereas here, React.js wants to blur the distinction between JavaScript and HTML and have them nicely embedded inside of one another. Okay, and so it makes lots of syntactic additions to the language so that you can seamlessly go between HTML, JavaScript, and whatnot. Okay. Okay. Let's see. Does that make sense? Okay. The other thing is that notice what we're also importing here. We're not only are we importing the obvious thing, right? We're importing libraries and functions, right? But look what we're importing over here. We're importing CSS. That's pretty cool. In the previous implementation, you would have to instead right, have the CSS, this CSS, right, have to be imported separately, right, in the HTML document, right, with separate links. Okay. So whereas in the in React.js, it allows you to import not only JavaScript, embed HTML inside the content, but it allows you to bring in CSS into the JavaScript world. Okay. So this is the equivalent of adding it to the link. So it allows you to basically leave the HTML document, .html document, and stay entirely within a JavaScript world. Okay. And obviously there's a lot of magic that happens behind the scenes that this gets compiled into the correct DOM elements, right? That the correct links, right? The correct DOM manipulations that insert this content in there. All right. All right. Ever still with me? Okay. So yeah. So great. So what is this now? So no longer are we going to be using HTML whatsoever. HTML documents. We're not going to be using HTML documents again, right? Throughout the semester, no more HTML documents. We are entirely going to stay within the JavaScript world, right? And a lot of things happen behind the scenes that when it gets compiled, right, it puts the right things, HTML and CSS and whatnot where they go. So anyway, so here's the index.js. So let's run it. How do we run it? Before, we would run it by right-clicking on the HTML document and say run. We're not going to do that anymore. Okay, we're going to stop doing that. Okay. Instead, we want to run this index. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, before, right, we were looking at all these HTML documents as independent HTML documents, right, that could be opened up with a browser, right, out of context, right? You could just open up the document and it could work all of its own because it loaded all the dependencies, the JavaScript, the CSS, right? It rendered the page. No longer that. Instead, we are going to now run our application within the context of a server, right? There's going to be a server who is going to parse all this, compile all this, okay? Needs to interpret all this and then generate the actual JavaScript and HTML and CSS, right, that gets rendered, right? Because this somehow needs to be converted into some link element that loads the index.css file, right? And somehow, right, this here needs to be converted into some string concatenation. Right? And this app here, right, this funny looking JavaScript, blended in with HTML, again, that needs to be compiled into a lower level implementation that, basically does string manipulation like we do in our own JavaScript and appends everything into the DOM, right? So everything is compiled into a lower level. So we're going to be working at this higher level, right, of JavaScript, which has a specific name. It's not just called plain old JavaScript. Okay, this weird new syntax of JavaScript blending in with HTML, okay, is called JSX. Right, so JavaScript XML, and HTML is just a particular version or particular dialect of the XML language. Right, so it's basically the blending of the JavaScript language with the XML language, right? That you can go back and forth. Make sense? Okay, excellent. So we're going to stick to this. So how do we run this? We need to run it inside of the server, and the server will do all the compilation for us and conversion. Right, so from the terminal, we're going to run this using npm start. So npm start is going to start up a local Node.js server that's going to host our application, and it's already configured to jump into this index.js as being the entry point of the application. right? There it is. This is the first, at the beginning of the semester, we played around with this as this being the default out of the box, React.js application. We still have all our labs in there. We're just going to abandon the public directory that we've been working for the last 5 weeks. Okay, we're going to abandon that, and instead we're going to move over to the source directory, right, where we're going to be working entirely with React.js for the remainder of the semester. Okay. Obviously, we're going to borrow some things from public, right, because we already have some HTML in there, some CSS styling that you're welcome to reuse any and all of that, right? You'll just have to make sure to do some surgery, and extract the pieces that interest you. Okay, so you're welcome to reuse that. So let's take a look at this index. So index has this has a few things here that we don't care for. There's this index.css. That's some default styling that we don't care for. So that's going to go away. And we're also in the app. There's this dummy content here of some logo, blah, blah. We're going to blow that away too. I'm just going to remove that. I'm not going to have any of that. Okay. And we don't really care about the blow that away too. So we don't care about this index here. We're going to create our own styling. So this is app.js, and we don't even care about that class because that was some legacy stuff. Right? So we can now say here, hello world. So this is the most basic hello world React application. Right? So this is kind of like the bare bones React hello world example. There we go. Oh, all right, excellent. So let's keep going. So here we want to host several content, right? We have a hello world here. We're going to have some labs here as well, right, that we're going to be working throughout this week, right? We're going to have Twitter that we need to include here, right? And we're going to have several assignments that are going to be implemented here. Starting with assignment 6, then assignment 7, and several of these. So 7, 8, 9, 8, 9. Right? And then Twitter is going to have lots of other content. Right? We're going to have the navigation bar. We're going to have the home screen. We're going to have the explore screen. Okay, all in here. Okay, so one of the things that React introduces is the notion that you should always look for opportunities to break out your application into modules, right? That will allow you to break up the work into smaller pieces so that they could be worked independently, right, individually. And so, for instance, one of the things that could be broken up is the whole lab stuff, right? That could be a whole thing. And then within the labs, then you have the various assignments. Right? And each assignment will have different exercises, right? So assignment 6, we have a exercise 1, then exercise 2, right? Something like that. So the whole labs might be nice if we could break it out into a separate thing. So for instance, a good idea to break this up is to perhaps have a separate folder with the labs, and then in there you could have the main content for the labs. Perhaps you could have the JavaScript here. We have an index.js, right, which would be the base. Ooh, I think I have double dots in there. Index. So the idea is that hey, you can foresee this being fairly complex stuff that contains lots and lots of work. So this perhaps should be broken out into a separate component here, where perhaps called labs, that could then return, right, the labs. Now look at what's happening here. If I paste this here, it's going to give me some errors that I can't just return that. And I know I said, hey, that you can embed HTML inside of JavaScript. Yes, true. But we need to follow some rules. One of the rules is that these return functions can only ever return one single thing. You might say, well, what do you mean? We can just return an H1 and H2, that's it? Well, no, it means that it needs to be grouped together as a single thing. So, meaning you could have a div, right, where this whole thing can live in here. That. So now we're good, right? I can export this labs here. Then we can import it back in here. Notice that right now the labs are not there because we removed it. But we can start using some of the magic that we saw earlier. That labs now becomes a tag. That function, when it's exported, right, I can then import it back as a tag. See that? And now notice that the labs are back in there. See that? Make sense? Okay. And same thing with with each individual assignment, right? Maybe there could be an assignment 6 that deals with all the exercises for assignment 6, right? So this could be maybe a directory that has 6. Each one of them would be in a different directory, perhaps 7. Then a 6 could be its own index file. This could be JavaScript index, and this would be a function called maybe assignment 6 that returns these assignment 6. I can remove this and put it back in here. Right, and remember, we need to put it inside of some element that groups them all together. Say export default assignment 6, so that back here, notice that the labs are gone, the assignment 6 are gone, so I removed it, but I can bring it back in again with that function, right? That's I called it assignment 6, and now it's a tag, right? That gets imported automatically. So the 6, which now we have back the assignment. See that? Same thing with assignment 7 and whatnot, but I'll leave that to you to do these other assignments. So the Twitter too, right? Back in the app.js, right? We have the Twitter here that has all sorts of parts, right? It contains the navigation bar, the different screens, right? The sidebars, right? So that too could live in its own little directory, right? Here maybe have a dedicated directory where we can work on the Twitter application, and that could be its own index file, right? That has a function called Twitter that calculates this Twitter here, right? So move that away and bring it in a div, right? And then export call Twitter, and here notice that Twitter's gone, right? But that's okay. We can bring it back in. Twitter. And there's Twitter back. Make sense? Yeah. Ever still with me? Okay. All right. So this looks awful. There's a few things that are missing, right? Definitely it looks doesn't look very pretty. So Certainly might want to bring in some styling libraries to make this look a little bit better presentable. So let's bring in Bootstrap. And one way to bring in Bootstrap is kind of like we did in the old days, right? When we were in the public directory. Basically, we would in the HTML, right? We would import the Bootstrap CSS file. We could do that too here, right? We could do this, right? Copy that, bring it into the top level root index.html, and we can import the Bootstrap right here, right? And because this index.html is includes our div where we are injecting everything, it would work, right? So if we do the link here, right, and say href and the vendors, then Bootstrap, then CSS, then Bootstrap main, right? Say rel style sheets, right? Notice that it would work, right? It's it would style it, and all the CSS classes would be available to us. But that's not the way we do it. So we're going to cut that out. Right there, it's gone. So again, we said that we were not going to be using the HTML anymore, right? That we were going to stay in the JavaScript world. So how do we do that from the JavaScript world? Okay. Somehow we need to import this. Okay. And it's in the vendors directory, but that's actually not available to us. Well, actually it is, but still, it's not a good idea. So instead, what we're going to do is that Bootstrap can be installed like a JavaScript library into the node modules. Node modules is where libraries should live. Right? You say, what install, yada, 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 nice icons and styling and lots of tool, really cool widgets. Right? This is where they would be installed. So how do we install that? So the way we install that is by using the file to say npm install Bootstrap. So what that's going to do, what that's going to do is going to download the libraries and it's going to put it in this node underscore module, right? Browse. I think it's not updated. Oh, there it is. And in here, you can go to this, CSS, there's our libraries. Okay, so we're going to import it from here. And the way you do that is from the entry point of our application, right, which is index.js. We can now import Bootstrap. We say import, and this is a CSS, so it doesn't come from a JavaScript file. Right? So we need to import the file itself. Right? So it's going to say Bootstrap. There it is. Notice that this is where it's finding it inside of node modules. See that? Node modules Bootstrap. Yeah, that's the one we want. And we can then navigate down to the various directories, CSS, and then Bootstrap there. Perfect. Okay. And notice that if we refresh, there's our Bootstrap. Everything good? Okay. The other thing is that we need to decide where we want to include the container, right, of adding padding. And it might be that we want to pad the whole thing, right, the whole application. And I'm going to go with that for now. But we might need to come back to that idea, right? Because it might be that I want to style the labs differently of how do I want to style the Twitter, right? Independently. So if I style it out here in the app.js, I'm styling it for everybody, right? For the labs and Twitter, they're all going to get this container class, right? And I might not want that a little later. So I'm going to say container here. There it is. So there it is. So I have the padding. Yeah. Again, we might need to come back to that a little later. Okay. Yeah. So the other thing that you'll notice here is that I did not use the attribute class like we have been normally when we are using plain old HTML. Instead, we're using class name, right? And the reason is that here we're not in really HTML, right? It looks like HTML, but it's not really HTML. This is really JavaScript. And class happens to be a reserved word in JavaScript, right? So here instead of class, we use class name. Eventually gets compiled down into class. Actually, if you use class, it will still work. If you refresh, it still works. But you'll get a nasty error message in the console saying that you should not. Or that you should not use class. It says, are you sure? Did you mean class name? Is that what you meant? Right. So if you want to stay nice with React.js, don't do that. So there's no errors if you use class names. Okay. All right. Excellent. So yeah. What else? Okay. So the other thing here is that we would want to not have all content at the same time, right? The hello world, whatever that is, the labs, and the Twitter. These seem to be somewhat distinct elements or parts, or maybe even screens, right? A screen that renders the labs, or another screen that renders Twitter, right? But not all at the same time. And even within the labs, I might want to be able to navigate and see only assignment 6, right? Or only assignment 7, 8, or 9. Right? So we need a mechanism that navigates, right? And displays one thing or another. Okay. So basically, we want to be able to go back and have some kind of like things like a hyperlink. And when I click on the hyperlink, it manipulates the URL up here, and then that navigates to different places, right? So I want to be able to say, hey, if I say labs, I only want to see the labs, right? Or if I see Twitter, then I only want to see the Twitter part. But instead, right, it's ignoring my URL. It's not doing anything with the URL. It's always rendering the same thing. So what do we do? So what we're going to do is that actually this is not using the navigation the way we think about it, right? It's using a technique called single page applications, right? And single page applications, like the name suggests, right? There's only one page ever, right? And we never leave that page. We always stay in that page. And that's would seem maybe somewhat unintuitive. I said, well, what do you mean? I mean, you need to be able to navigate to different parts. You know, every application has all sorts of different screens. I want to be able to sometimes show this screen, you know, the login screen. Sometimes I want to see the profile screen. Sometimes I want to see my cart, right? And I want to be able to separate it like that, right? So yes, we want that, right? But we don't want the old way of doing it, which was throw away the old HTML and then replace it with a new HTML. We don't want to do that anymore. So instead, but we still want to navigate, you know, sometimes show one thing or another. So how can we do that, you know, while staying in the same single screen? Well, I mean, we could, you know, instead of doing this, right, we could declare a constant, right, that says this is hello, and this is equal to this, right, like that. See that? And this would be the variable hello. Notice that this still works. So here's another thing that I'm introducing is that these curly brackets, see those curly brackets? That allows you to escape HTML. So here we are in JavaScript, HTML. And then these little curly brackets allow you to escape back into JavaScript. So this hello here is not the words hello, it is the variable hello, right? So notice if I remove the curly brackets, right, then it's interpreted as the literal string hello. But if I put it in between curly brackets, then it's an expression that gets evaluated. And so curly brackets allow you to escape back to JavaScript, right? So they allow you to easily go from JavaScript to HTML, back to JavaScript, then back to HTML seamlessly. And so same thing here. We could say const labs. Say that this is labs. Notice how cool, right? Now you are assigning to a JavaScript variable. You are assigning HTML, right? Seamlessly. Right? Again, that's the syntax, the JSX syntax. And finally, const to declare local variable. Twitter best. And this would be Twitter. I mean, labs. This could be Twitter. And this works just the same. But then what I could do is maybe control that sometimes I want to see one but not the other. So I could say, for instance, a variable, say constant a screen, that if it says hello, right, then I want to display hello. But if it says labs, then I want to show labs. If it says Twitter, I want to show Twitter. So how can I do that? So one way that I can do it is I could say screen is equal to hello. Then evaluate to hello, right? Or evaluate to null. And so it is equal to hello. And I could say over here, I could say if the screen instead is equal to labs, right? Then evaluates to labs, otherwise to null. So notice that the labs don't show anymore. And this says, if the screen is equal to Twitter, then evaluate to Twitter, otherwise no. There it is, right? So I could control with this variable now, right? If I say that this is labs, then it shows the labs, right? And if I say this is Twitter, then it would show only Twitter. So I could certainly choose what to show, right? And certainly what I could do is put some hyperlinks that when I click on the hyperlink, it can hide some content, show some content, and so this is the underlying basics of what we're going to be doing. Okay, but we're not going to be doing it so low level and backwards. Right? This is a very, very rudimentary mechanism, right, of implementing navigation. I'm only pointing out the fact that we can, based on some logic, decide to show one thing or another. Okay, and we could say another way that this could have been implemented. We could say, instead we could say it's been, if screen, right, is equal to hello, right, then we return, right, we return one hello world, right? Could implement this other way instead. Instead of this return, we could have this, and then we could have maybe an else that would return null. Okay. So notice that if this is hello, then this returns hello, or returns, well, this returns hello. Yeah. Right? And we could say, an else if, right? Else if screen is equal to labs, right? Then oops. Right, then if it's labs, then we return the labs. So like that, right? Oops. Oops. There we go. So if this were labs, right, then it would return labs. And finally, we would have another one here that says if it's equal to Twitter, then it returns Twitter. So if that is Twitter, then it returns Twitter. Okay. And somehow we could control this variable screen of which one we want to display. Everybody good? Okay. So we're not going to do it this way. We're not going to do this way. How are we going to do it? How are we going to do this? The way we're going to do it is as follows. We have a return. We have our return where we have our div class container, right? And we have our labs. We have our h1 hello, our labs, and we have our Twitter, right? And the way we're going to do this is as follows. We're going to use a special library that specializes in this. It specializes making, bringing back the hyperlinks as the main way of navigating and choosing where you want to go, which screens you want to see. It's going to bring that back in. Also, when you click on those hyperlinks, they're going to behave like real hyperlinks. Actually, you're not going to be able to tell them apart from the real hyperlinks. They're going to change the URL. And when the URL changes, right, we're going to be able to configure that, right? If the URL says something, then what we want to be able to do is that if this is labs, that's our variable. We want to grab the variable from there, from what the URL says. If it says labs, then I want to display labs, right? If instead it says Twitter, right? That's the variable I want to grab, right? And then tells me where to go. Right? We want the URL to drive this, okay? The way we were doing it before, okay? But staying in the same page. All right, so how do we do that? So let's install a library that is going to allow us to do that. So the library is called npm install React Router. So React Router is a library that allows to implement routing, right? That says if you have this path, then show this. If you have this other path, then show that. And it's not only useful here on the web, but it's also useful in other devices such as mobile applications, desktops. Okay, that also needs to navigate between screens. Right. Now, specifically for us, for HTML, we need another additional library that is specific to the DOM. Right. So, question on the chat. Does React use TypeScript as well, or only both of them? Yeah, you can use either language. Yeah, TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript, right? And actually, TypeScript gets compiled down to JavaScript. So since we are on the web, right? Not only do we need that library, we also need another library, the React Router, the DOM version of the library as well. Right? DOM because web, right? The browser talks about DOMs. So there it is. We have those. So how do we implement navigation that is driven by the URL? Okay, so here's how we do it. I'm going to import from the React Router DOM, which we just installed. We're going to bring in a browser router from the React Router DOM library. And what we're going to do is that we're going to wrap this whole thing in a browser router. Wrap this whole thing in a browser router like that. Okay, what that's going to do is going to bring us the basics mechanism that is going to allow us to listen to the changes in the URL and then react and display certain things based on that. So anywhere inside of browser router, it doesn't matter. It could be right here, but because we want all these to be included inside of the container, here we're going to declare a whole bunch of routes. So routes is going to implement that if statement that we had earlier. Right? The if statement that we had earlier said, if the screen is labs, then display the labs HTML, right? And if the screen variable was Twitter, then display Twitter. But we want to grab that variable from the URL. Okay, so what we can declare here are if statements. If the path of the URL ends with labs. I think those slashes. Yeah. I want to display the following elements. I want to display labs. Like that. Okay. And close that. So this labs is taken care of. If instead it says hello, then I want to display this H1. Display that right here. It says hello. Oops. And if instead it says Twitter, then I want to display this Twitter. Yeah. All right. So notice that my URL already had Twitter there, and notice that it's already just displayed Twitter. Right. If I change this to labs, notice that it displays labs. See that? Look at that. Right. And if I say hello, right, it just displays hello. Like perfect. This is exactly what we wanted to do, right? We wanted the URL to be able to drive what the screen was displaying. Yeah. Now, say we want the default to be labs. We want the default to be labs. A couple ways of doing it. We could say that we map the labs to the slash, right? So that, for instance, if there's if this is nothing, then it loads the lab. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it, it's preferable to say that this is the index. The index, meaning this is the default, right, as opposed to the path, right? So that if there's nothing, right, if I refresh and there's nothing in the URL, then this plays the role of the index screen. This is the default thing that you see. Okay. Question in the chat. Let's see. What happens if my path? Yeah, if it doesn't match, so this is literally pattern matched, right? So if this pattern match and compared against the paths, if it can't find an exact match, right, it won't render anything. So if I say labs, what is it? It doesn't match anything, so nothing gets rendered. Okay. You could use wildcards, right? That say star, right? If it matches anything, like a catch-all, right? Because these are tested in order, just like if statements, right? This is literally like an if else, if else, if else, if else. So if this, boom, I'm done. If this, then boom, it's done, right? Okay. All right. All right, excellent. So in each now we can start, focusing on individual parts of these. Right? So for instance, in the labs, I can focus on maybe just working on the exercises for assignment 6, okay? And start working with various exercises. And so now we can introduce the assignment 6 exercises and see how far we're in. Another thing that you should notice that the back buttons work just like before, right? So as I move between the back buttons, backwards and forwards, they work the way they used to work before, right? Which is great. It's supposed to behave exactly like before, right? That as the URL changes with the history of where I have been, right, and in the history of URLs, right, then those will trigger the loading and rendering of the correct components. Makes sense? Now, one might ask, well, why do we go through this all this work? I mean, we already had navigation. Couldn't we have just used hyperlinks like before? And that's a fair question. And the reason why we're going this way is it's why we're going single page application as opposed to multiple pages. It could have been that the multiple pages, each one was a React component. That's fine, right? But why are we introducing this new navigation mechanism, right? Why are we sticking to multiple pages, right? Each one may be a different React component, right? And the reason is that the most applications, right, have a lot of static content. And you have some dynamic portions, but a lot of it is static that doesn't change, right? That the headers and like for instance here, the only part that is dynamic is the center in the middle, right? The most of the left-hand side is not changing, most of the menus are not changing, right? And the bottom half sometimes changes. And so what we'd like to be able to do is make the things that are dynamic, but then most everything else, right, stays unchanged, or at least changes very slowly, so that we don't want to, for instance, to make this dynamic, we don't want to have to redraw the entire screen. Right? We would like to be able to be more granular on the parts that need to be dynamic, and then so we can focus efforts and resources and making those dynamic and leave everything alone, right? So the old way, right, for instance, the old way where, for instance, you create a new tweet, you make a new post, or you make some change. The only way to give feedback that change had occurred was to redraw the entire screen. Okay, and whereas what we're going to be doing here is that we're going to be optimizing, right, and only loading parts that are needed, right? Everything else we can leave alone. Okay, so yeah. So for instance, right, anything that doesn't have a route, right? I could make here a header. Let's say H1. This is the web dev. Welcome to web dev. Right? Notice that it's outside the routes. That means that that's always going to render. Right. So if I go to hello, to Twitter, right? Notice that it's always there. Welcome to web dev is always there. What's changing is what's in the routes. See that? Okay. So there's an opportunity to take stuff out of the routes, right? And maybe like the sidebar could stay, right? The headers could stay, maybe the right sidebar could stay, left sidebar, footer, and then the main content could change over time as you navigate between different screens. But we keep the left-hand side, we keep the right-hand side, maybe the headers, footers, and the rest can change inside the content. Make sense? So yeah, so we can distinguish, right? This being the header, maybe the footer down below. Right? This is this is the footer. Right, so here's the footer not changing, right? If I go to labs, right, we have oh wait, no, not labs. It's a slash, right? Yeah. So there's the labs and there's a footer down below. See that? So yeah, so that's one of the reasons. So anyway, we've been working with all these tabs, typing the actual links in there. Ideally, we would have an actual navigation screen, right, that would allow us to navigate, right? So let's add some of those. So the way we do that is by adding links. Right. So links allows you to, like the name suggests, allows you to create hyperlinks. Right. That if you want to navigate to labs, right, you can create those hyperlinks and say that this would take me to a particular path. For instance, slash. Yeah. Or if you see another hyperlink that says hello, right, it would take me to the hello. These actually change or modify the URL at the top. And so this says tweet or Twitter, right? Then lets me navigate. So for instance, if I click on Twitter, notice that it changes the URL at the top. Hello, labs. See that? Allows me to navigate between all these. Just basically driving the content of the URL and then whatnot. See that? Now, notice what's not happening is that the whole document is being re-rendered, right? This up above here never gets re-rendered. Only the bottom part, right, gets re-rendered at the bottom. And notice how smooth it is, right? You don't see a jerky reaction, effect like you would if this were actually navigating and throwing away the HTML document and replacing it with a brand new. Instead, this is very, very smooth, right? Where basically we are dynamically replacing content in the DOM, right? Putting stuff in and out and whatnot, right? So we'll put some separation between these labs, flow, and whatnot. Yeah, I noticed that these are outside of the route, right? So they're always there, right? And it allows you to navigate once. Everybody good? Now this would be a nice component, a little nav component, right? So we could implement that here, perhaps call it the nav. TypeScript is call it the nav, right? And this would be a function. Now we've been using function, but you can use the new syntax, nav, the new arrow syntax instead. And this would be these links here. So if we grab that. So we're going to put this link here. So typically what we do is you do a return, right? And this would say div, these links, right? And then the export default nav. And so in here, you could replace this now with nav. See that? And now it works. Are we good? Yeah. So, but because you're using the new syntax here, you have opportunity to use this syntax. You have the opportunity to abuse this syntax. Well, it's not an abuse, right? It's actually I think it's a great feature. Notice that here we only have a single line, don't we? So we have a single line here. We just have that return. That's the only thing this function is doing. And what did we learn about when arrow functions have a single return? We can remove the return and remove the curly bracket. Huh? Right? And we can just remove this whole thing. Now that looks weird. That's totally kosher. Right? What does this nav evaluate to? It evaluates to this div. See that? Look at that. Right? If you refresh, right, it works just the same. Okay. Yeah. That's pretty cool, right? Actually, can we do this too? Export default. You can just you can just export the function like that, right? The problem with this, let's see. Oh yeah, no, it works just the same. that you don't even have to call the function, right? You can just export the whole thing without even naming the function. So that's pretty cool, right? Or this could be an entire. It doesn't even have to be a function, right? It doesn't have to even be a function. You are declaring this variable. This is the same as declaring a variable. It's hard coded, right? It's not being compiled. Actually, no, I didn't like that. We would assign it to a function, right? To a variable, and then we can export that. Okay. All right. We could take a look at that later. Yeah. So let's take a look at the assignment, what you're asked to do. Okay, so in the assignment, you're asked to work in the labs, just like always, right? Labs, you do the labs, then the Twitter part, and then the challenge, right? So for the labs, you are asked to bring back the root, which we just did, right? And then in the index, it's just going through the source index, just introducing the fact that we are using index. I believe it just shows the index having removed index.css. It also introduced app, right? That the first thing that it does is just plays around with hello world, and so it asks you to do that. Install Bootstrap. Also install Bootstrap icons. This is an alternative to Font Awesome, right? And it also has icons, but within the Bootstrap library. You're welcome to keep using Font Awesome, but it'd be nice if you could try this other library, Bootstrap icons. And then you can import them here in your index.js. It then asks you to kind of create a labs folder and a component, right, like we showed you, and then import it in there with the assignment 6. And then it says that you're going to create an assignment 6 component where each new assignment you're going to create a component for that assignment, right? And then you're going to import it in there. So this is our A6 assignment 6 component, right? And just adding it in there in the labs, like we did, like I showed you, right? This one goes out and breaks out the hello world into its own component. I didn't do that in the lecture, but here you're asked to do that. And then bring in the hello world. Same thing with a placeholder for the Twitter application that you're going to be asked to implement later on, which we'll get to tomorrow. And then bring in the Twitter. And then walks you through implementing navigation by installing React Router and then installing React Router DOM. And then adding browser router, basically what we did today, right? Browser router, bring in routes and route, and declare the path and the elements. Basically what we did today, do that on your own. And then declaring labs as the default screen, right? Adding navigation links. This one took a different React way, right? Added links to all the components, right? And then it says, ooh, we could create a navigation component that had the links, and then we could reuse that in each one of the elements, right? As opposed to putting it outside the route, that's another way. I put it outside the route. This one put it inside of each one of them, so that you have these hyperlinks at the top. It's fine if you implement it the way I did it in the lecture. I think it's a better way. Then it goes into several exercises, right, which we didn't do today, right? So it goes into the first component called the classes component, just playing around with some classes, just to point out the fact that you don't use a class attribute, instead you use the class name attribute because class is a reserved word. And plays around with some of the colors in your CSS. And then bringing in the classes component, and then introduces the notion that you can play around with classes. Typically, these are hard-coded strings, These are hard-coded strings, but here we're pointing out the fact that it doesn't have to be a hard-coded string. Instead, it could be an expression. Notice the curly brackets. See that? The curly brackets allows you to escape the HTML world. So up to this point, it is all HTML, right? Up to this point. The curly bracket allows you to go back into JavaScript mode, and it's you have to curly brackets need to evaluate to something that is a valid string or something that evaluates dynamically to some HTML. Okay, something that you could be replaced in here as valid HTML. Okay, so this evaluates to a string, which is it's a string that is calculated that depending on the value of the variable color, this will be, WG, BG, blue, red, green, yellow, blah, 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 right? Which will render dynamically here different colors, right? Here's a couple more, right? Depending on a variable dangerous, we are dynamically choosing either red or green, right? If it's dangerous, true, then it comes back with red. Otherwise, it responds with green, right? So some knowledge of how to calculate dynamic classes. Now, styles also it can be worked. You can play around with styles. Now, the styles attribute style as in singular style. So we don't use the style attribute at all in React.js. Instead, we use the styles attribute, right? Plural. And it doesn't behave the same way as you would expect. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I say style? Sorry, style. It is style, but it doesn't behave the same way that you expect. And notice that it is an expression. It needs to be an expression. It has to be an expression, and it takes as argument a JSON object, which coincidentally looks very much like CSS, right? Where you have the name of some attribute or property, and then the value using colon, right? Very, very much like CSS. But because it's not CSS, right? These are not separated with semicolons. Instead, it's just plain old commas, because it is indeed. See, notice double curly bracket. I was blown away the first time I saw that same thing. What the heck is that? It just means that the first curly bracket means that this whole thing is an expression. This whole thing is a JavaScript expression, and that expression happens to be a JSON object, right? Of which you have several name value pairs, right? Name value, name value, name value, right? So background is equal to color, color is equal to black, and padding is equal to 10 pixels. So it's a JSON object. That means that I could put an actual JSON object there. Look at this. See this? BG red. That's an object instance, which is declared up here. See that? It's BG red right here. See that? Look at that. It's a JSON object that declares a property, background color, light color, but then it copies, right, this ... It's a JavaScript syntax that means copy the content of this other object, color black. So color black is an object that contains an attribute of color black. So it's as if I copy all the content of color black in right here. Just copy it right there. And that says also copy padding 10. That means that all the content of padding 10 gets copied over here. See that? Right? So big blue is it's background color light blue and color black, but then copied also the padding 10. See that? So these objects are then used to as values of the style attribute, which render 3 divs, a yellow, red, and blue. Okay. Conditional output allows you to dynamically calculate the output depending on the value. We saw this already as an example of this, right? Where depending on the value of the variable, it returned something else, right? Based on a switch case statement. If that, if then, if else, if else, if else, right? So yeah, this is the same thing, right? If it's logged in true, then we return welcome. Otherwise, if I'm not logged in, it says please log in. Here's another example using inline, right? If statements, where this is a Boolean expression, right? If the left-hand side is true in the AND, then the right-hand side gets evaluated. Otherwise, if the left hand is false, then the right-hand side is not evaluated. And that evaluation renders the content, right? So if logged in is false, so this would be false, and that means this whole thing is false. So it doesn't get evaluated. What it gets evaluated is not logged in. So true, so false, not false. So this is true, right? If I'm not logged in, then you render please log in inline, right? And we see that the output should verify that. Both components are combined into a larger component called the conditional output component, right? Which renders both of them, right? And there, please log in, see that. Then you play. It asks you to re-implement some of the stuff that you worked on in the previous assignment. You worked on the to-do list in JavaScript. So this kind of gives you a chance to see how to re-implement that, but using React.js, right? I give you everything, so you don't have to actually do anything. You have to just copy and paste it and make sure it works. But here it is, right? The to-do item. It looks very, very similar to how it was implemented in JavaScript. But here we don't have strings, right? We're using JSX instead. Here's to-do, where you iterate over these to-dos and render the to-do list. Okay. Anyway, we'll cover Twitter tomorrow. Again, tomorrow is a continuation of today's lecture, and we will continue then. All right. All right. Any questions? What does React do better than other frameworks like Angular? So React is well known for being highly performant. Although I would say that the newer versions of Angular are comparable in performance to React. But one of the biggest appeals to React.js is that it's not really a framework. Right? Angular is a framework, whereas React.js is just a JavaScript library. It's a very simple JavaScript library that doesn't have any opinions about a lot of stuff, which Angular does. Angular kind of takes over the entire development. No quiz 3. I'm not done yet. I'll make it available later tomorrow. So Angular, it cares about how do you implement the model. It makes sure it implements several design patterns of separating the view, right, from the model, from the controller, right? It implements the model view controller very well. It also has a lot of opinions on how to communicate with the backend through services. Implements inversion of control. It's an entire framework, right? It's not just a library. React.js only cares about how things get rendered on the screen, right? It doesn't care how you're getting the data from the server, right? It doesn't care how you're caching. It's not implementing any complex inversion of control design patterns. So it leaves that all those decisions. You still have to make those decisions, right? And so it's much lighter to work with React.js, even Vue.js, than with Angular. Some folks actually prefer the fact that Angular just takes over the whole thing, and as long as you stay within the walled garden, right, and you implement your application in a specific way, right, you'll be very, very successful. Yeah, I did Angular for years, until version 3 came out, and I think Google made a strategic mistake on not making the new versions backwards compatible with older versions, and so basically, industry folks that were using Angular kind of were left in the, oh, wait a minute, I need to re-implement my application. If I want to move over to the next newer version, I need to kind of like throw away everything I did and just re-implement the whole thing. And that pissed off some folks and said, well, why not just try another library, right? And and React.js was kind of there at the right time when Angular kind of dropped the ball, and folks were already trying out React.js, and then React.js just took off from there on. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. Any other questions? All right. Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Good night. Okay. Tomorrow, I have my office hours at 11. I'll make a post.